The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble. Picture this. It's December 16th, 1944, and you're an American soldier stationed in the Ardennes Forest of Belgium. You've been told this is a quiet sector, a place where green troops get their feet wet and exhausted veterans catch their breath. The war's almost over anyway, right? The Nazis are on their last legs, retreating back to Germany. Christmas is just 9 days away, and you're thinking about home, about family, about the hot meal you might get if you're lucky. The forest around you is peaceful, covered in snow, almost beautiful in its silence. Then, at exactly 5:30 in the morning, the entire world explodes. That's how it began. The largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. A desperate all-or-nothing gamble by Adolf Hitler that would claim over 100,000 casualties and change the course of the war's final months. This is the story of the Battle of the Bulge, and I'm going to tell you how Hitler nearly pulled off the impossible, how American soldiers fought against overwhelming odds in the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades, and how this one battle almost rewrote history. Let me take you back a few months before that frozen December morning. By the fall of 1944, Nazi Germany was collapsing. The Allies had landed at Normandy in June, and by September, they'd liberated France and were pushing toward the German border. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was steamrolling through Poland. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was crumbling after just 12 years, and everyone knew it. Everyone, that is, except Hitler himself. Deep in his bunker, the Führer was plotting. While his generals prepared for defensive operations, convinced their only hope was to delay the inevitable, Hitler was dreaming of something audacious, something insane, something that might just work. He was planning a massive counteroffensive that would split the Allied armies in two, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a peace treaty. It was the kind of desperate plan that only makes sense when you're a megalomaniac staring down the barrel of total defeat. Hitler called it Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive-sounding name designed to fool Allied intelligence. But there was nothing defensive about it. He was assembling a strike force of over 200,000 men, hundreds of tanks including the fearsome Tiger and Panther models, and 1,900 aircraft. He was scraping together every reserve he had, pulling men from everywhere, giving them priority for fuel and ammunition that the rest of his armies desperately needed, and he was going to throw them all at the weakest point in the Allied line, the Ardennes Forest. Now, why the Ardennes? Because it was the same route the Germans had used to devastating effect in 1940, when they bypassed the Maginot Line and conquered France in 6 weeks. The Allies remembered that, of course, but they'd convinced themselves that lightning couldn't strike twice in the same place. The Ardennes was heavily forested, the roads were poor, and it seemed like terrible tank country. So they'd stationed only 4 divisions there, spread thin across an 80-mile front. Some of these were fresh units with no combat experience. Others were exhausted divisions sent there to rest and refit. It was the perfect target. Hitler's plan was audacious in its scope. His armies would punch through the American lines in the Ardennes, race northwest to the Meuse River, cross it before the Allies could react, and then drive all the way to Antwerp, Belgium's crucial port city. This would cut off the British and Canadian armies in the north from the American forces in the south, trapping them without supplies. Faced with such a catastrophe, Hitler believed, the British and Americans would sue for peace, allowing him to turn all his forces east to deal with the Soviets. His generals thought he was delusional. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, considered the plan impossibly optimistic. Model, Manteuffel, and the other field commanders proposed more limited objectives, but Hitler wouldn't hear it. It was Antwerp or nothing. All or nothing. One last roll of the dice. The Germans spent weeks preparing in complete secrecy. They moved troops and tanks only at night. They banned radio communications. They used horses instead of trucks wherever possible to avoid detection. They even flew aircraft overhead to drown out the sound of tank engines. The deception was remarkably effective. Allied intelligence noticed some activity, but they interpreted it as defensive preparations. After all, the Germans were beaten, weren't they? They couldn't possibly be planning an offensive. On December 15th, the day before the attack, German soldiers were issued winter uniforms, extra rations, and ammunition. Many were told they'd be home by Christmas. The veterans among them, the ones who'd survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, knew better. They'd seen too many promises broken, too many final victories turn into desperate retreats. But the younger soldiers, the ones who'd been in the Hitler Youth, who'd been raised on Nazi propaganda, still believed. They still thought they could win. That night, as American soldiers in the Ardennes settled into their foxholes and bunkers, trying to stay warm in the bitter cold, German assault troops moved into position. 3 armies were about to crash into the American lines. The 6th SS Panzer Army in the north under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army in the center under Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army in the south under Erich Brandenberger. Together, they outnumbered the Americans facing them by more than 3-1. Then came 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, and the world caught fire. Over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along the entire front. American positions that had been quiet for months were suddenly engulfed in explosions. Shells rained down on command posts, supply depots, and frontline positions. The barrage lasted for over an hour, and when it finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise, because in that silence, the Americans could hear what was coming: the rumble of tank engines and the shouts of thousands of German soldiers emerging from the fog and snow. What happened next was chaos. Utter, complete chaos. American units that had never seen combat before were overrun in minutes. Experienced units fought desperately, but were surrounded and cut off. Communications broke down. Nobody knew what was happening or how big the attack was. Some commanders thought it was just a local counterattack. Others, the ones on the ground watching panzers roll past their positions, knew it was something much worse. In the northern sector, the 6th SS Panzer Army slammed into the green troops of the 99th Infantry Division. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, these inexperienced Americans fought with unexpected ferocity. They didn't know enough to be afraid, and they held positions that more experienced troops might have abandoned. Their resistance delayed the German advance by crucial hours, buying time for reserves to move up. But further south, in the area defended by the 106th Infantry Division, the situation was catastrophic. The 106th had only arrived in the Ardennes a few days earlier. Most of its men had never heard a shot fired in anger. When 3 German divisions hit them from multiple directions, entire regiments were surrounded. Over 7,000 men would eventually be forced to surrender, the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. And then there was Kampfgruppe Piper. This was a special battle group led by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper, one of the most aggressive and ruthless commanders in the German army. His task was to be the spearhead, to break through the American lines and race for the Meuse River before anyone could stop him. He had the best tanks, the best men, and priority for fuel and ammunition, and he was about to earn a place in history for all the wrong reasons. Piper's column smashed through the American front lines and drove deep into the rear areas. They were moving so fast that they overran American supply depots before the defenders even knew what was happening. At one crossroads near the town of Malmedy, Piper's troops came across an American convoy, Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. These weren't combat troops. They were surveyors and spotters, armed with little more than carbines and pistols. The Germans quickly forced them to surrender. What happened next would become one of the most infamous war crimes of World War II. The American prisoners were herded into a field. Then, without warning, German machine guns opened fire. 84 Americans were murdered in cold blood. Some survived by playing dead in the snow, lying motionless among their dead comrades as German soldiers walked among the bodies, shooting anyone who showed signs of life. When word of the Malmedy Massacre spread through the American lines, it hardened resolve in a way nothing else could have. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It was personal. But Piper didn't have time to worry about what was happening behind him. He was racing forward, trying to maintain momentum, and he was running into a problem that would plague the entire German offensive: fuel. The Germans had planned to capture American fuel depots along the way, but the Americans were blowing them up before the Germans could reach them. Piper's powerful tanks guzzled gasoline at an alarming rate, and he was constantly on the edge of running dry. Meanwhile, as news of the attack spread up the chain of command, the American response began to take shape. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, meeting with his staff at SHAEF headquarters in Versailles, quickly grasped the magnitude of what was happening. While some of his subordinates panicked, Eisenhower saw opportunity. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster," he told his commanders. If the Germans wanted to come out from behind their fortifications and fight in the open, so be it. The Allies would crush them. Eisenhower immediately began shifting reserves toward the Ardennes. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting after the failed Operation Market Garden, were ordered to move out immediately. The 82nd was sent to the northern shoulder of the German advance, the 101st to a little crossroads town in the center that most of the Americans had never heard of: Bastogne. Bastogne. That name would become legendary, synonymous with courage and stubborn resistance. It was a nothing town, really, just a few thousand people living in eastern Belgium. But it sat at the junction of 7 major roads, and whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. The Germans needed it. The Americans couldn't afford to lose it. The 101st Airborne arrived in Bastogne just ahead of the German advance. These were elite troops, veterans of D-Day and Market Garden, but they'd left most of their heavy equipment behind in their rush to get to the front. They had rifles, machine guns, and whatever they could scrounge. No winter uniforms for most of them, just the summer uniforms they'd been wearing when the call came. No winter boots, inadequate ammunition, and the Germans were coming with tanks. Commanding the 101st was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, a no-nonsense artilleryman who'd been acting division commander since the actual commander was away. McAuliffe set up a perimeter defense around Bastogne and prepared his men for what was coming. Other units were streaming through the town, retreating from the German advance, and McAuliffe gathered up anyone who would fight: tank destroyers, engineers, stragglers from broken units. He was assembling a motley defense force to hold a town that the entire German 5th Panzer Army wanted to capture. The Germans surrounded Bastogne on December 21st, cutting it off completely. McAuliffe and his men were trapped, low on ammunition, low on medical supplies, and with hundreds of wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated. The weather was terrible, with heavy clouds preventing any air support or resupply. Things looked grim. Then, on December 22nd, the Germans sent a delegation under a flag of truce. They delivered a formal surrender demand to McAuliffe. The message emphasized the hopeless situation, the overwhelming German force surrounding the town, and offered honorable terms if the Americans would just give up. McAuliffe's response has become part of military legend. He read the German ultimatum, thought for a moment, and said nuts. His staff initially thought he was joking, but McAuliffe was serious. That was his official response. When one of his officers pointed out that the Germans might not understand American slang, McAuliffe told him to figure it out. The final written response delivered to the puzzled German officers read simply, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." The Germans didn't understand it at first. They had to ask what it meant. When it was explained that it meant "go to hell," they were shocked. They'd expected the Americans to surrender. Instead, they got defiance. The battle for Bastogne would continue. While Bastogne was being surrounded, fierce fighting was raging all across the Ardennes. In the north, American forces were slowly stabilizing the line. The 99th Infantry Division, despite being green troops, continued to fight with remarkable tenacity. The 2nd Infantry Division launched counterattacks that slowed the German advance. The 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red one, rushed to plug holes in the line, But it was small units and individual acts of courage that were really saving the day. At the town of St. Vith, the 7th Armored Division and remnants of other units held out for days against overwhelming odds, tying down German forces that were supposed to be racing toward the Meuse River. They eventually had to withdraw, but they'd bought precious time. Engineers blew bridges just as German tanks approached. Small groups of soldiers ambushed German columns on narrow forest roads. Tank destroyers and anti-tank guns, outnumbered and outgunned, took on the mighty German Tigers and Panthers at point-blank range. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't organized, but it was effective. The German advance was slowing down, and then there was the fuel problem. Remember how I mentioned the Germans were planning to capture American fuel? That wasn't working out. Every American unit that retreated made sure to destroy its fuel dumps first. German tanks were constantly running low, and without fuel, even the best tank is just an expensive pillbox. Piper's spearhead group, which had pushed further than any other German unit, finally ground to a halt near the village of Stoumont, out of fuel and surrounded. Piper and most of his men managed to escape on foot, but they had to abandon all their vehicles. By December 23rd, the weather finally cleared, and that changed everything. Allied aircraft, which had been grounded for days by fog and clouds, suddenly filled the skies. Fighter bombers attacked German columns, destroying tanks and trucks. Heavy bombers struck German supply lines and assembly areas. And crucially, transport aircraft began dropping supplies to the besieged garrison at Bastogne. The men of the 101st Airborne watched parachutes fill the sky above them, bringing ammunition, medical supplies, and food. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was hope. It was proof they hadn't been abandoned, and it meant they could keep fighting. The Germans made repeated attempts to break into Bastogne. Tank assaults, infantry assaults, combined assaults. McAuliffe's men beat them all back. The paratroopers fought from houses, from foxholes, from behind snowbanks. They improvised anti-tank weapons. They called in artillery strikes danger close to their own positions. They held. South of Bastogne, General George Patton was performing what many military historians consider his finest achievement. Eisenhower had ordered Patton to break off his operations in the Saar region and drive north to relieve Bastogne. This meant turning an entire army 90 degrees, moving it over winter roads, and launching a coordinated attack, all within days. It was a logistical nightmare. Most commanders would have said it was impossible. Patton said he could do it in 48 hours. He couldn't quite manage 48 hours, but it was close. Patton's Third Army wheeled north and began hammering at the southern shoulder of the German Bulge. They fought through terrible weather, against fierce resistance, pushing forward mile by bloody mile. Patton was determined to reach Bastogne by Christmas. He didn't quite make it, but he was close. Inside the perimeter at Bastogne, Christmas Day was grim. The men had no Christmas dinner, just K-rations and whatever they could scrounge. They were still surrounded, still under constant attack, still freezing in inadequate uniforms. But morale was holding. McAuliffe circulated among his troops, projecting confidence he might not have felt. Chaplains held Christmas services in between German attacks, and the men kept fighting. On December 26th, the weather was clear and cold. Inside Bastogne, the defenders were down to their last artillery shells, rationing them carefully. Then, around 4:45 p.m., they heard something. The sound of tank engines approaching from the south. German engines? No, these sounded different. American tanks. The lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division had broken through. The siege of Bastogne was lifted. The paratroopers and the tankers met on the road, exhausted, frozen, but victorious. Bastogne had held. The German plan to race through the town was in ruins, but the battle wasn't over. In fact, some of the fiercest fighting was still to come. The Germans continued attacking Bastogne even after it was relieved. trying to cut it off again. In the north, they were still pushing toward the Meuse River. Hitler refused to call off the offensive, even though it was clear to everyone that it had failed. He'd gambled everything and lost, but he couldn't admit it. The German advance had created a bulge in the Allied lines, which is how the battle got its name. At its deepest point, the Germans had pushed about 50 miles into Allied territory, but they'd failed to reach any of their major objectives. They hadn't crossed the Meuse River. They hadn't captured Bastogne. They hadn't split the Allied armies. And now, American forces were counterattacking from north and south, trying to cut off the bulge and trap the German forces inside. The weather, which had been Germany's ally in the first days of the offensive, was now their enemy. Clear skies meant Allied aircraft ruled the air. German columns couldn't move in daylight without being attacked. Their supply lines were being strangled. Tanks that broke down or ran out of fuel had to be abandoned. The retreat that Hitler refused to order was happening anyway, piecemeal and chaotic. In early January, as American forces pushed from both sides, Hitler finally authorized a withdrawal, but it was too late to save many of his best units. They'd been bled white in weeks of intense combat. Tanks that had started the offensive with full fuel tanks were now being towed or destroyed to prevent capture. The SS Panzer divisions, Hitler's elite forces, were shadows of their former strength. By the end of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The Americans had pushed the Germans back to their starting positions and beyond. The Bulge had been flattened. But the cost had been horrific on both sides. Let me give you some numbers, because numbers can't capture the horror, but they can give you the scale. The Americans suffered approximately 90,000 casualties, 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. It was the bloodiest battle fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. The Germans lost between 80,000 and 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. But more importantly, they lost tanks, aircraft, and supplies they couldn't replace. Hitler had spent his strategic reserve, his last mobile forces, and had nothing to show for it. The battle had other consequences too. It delayed the Allied advance into Germany by several weeks, which meant the war would last longer. It meant more cities bombed, more concentration camps operating, more Holocaust victims murdered. Some historians have argued that if Hitler had used these forces defensively, instead of in a failed offensive, he might have prolonged the war by months. Others argue that the battle actually shortened the war by destroying Germany's last reserves in a single, catastrophic gamble. What's certain is that after the Bulge, Germany's defeat was inevitable and imminent. The Soviets launched their massive winter offensive in Poland in mid-January, and the Germans had no reserves to stop them. The Western Allies resumed their advance toward the Rhine in February. The end was coming, and Hitler had ensured it would come sooner rather than later. But let's talk about the human side of this battle, because that's what really matters. The soldiers who fought in the Bulge experienced some of the worst combat conditions imaginable. It wasn't just the enemy, it was the weather. Temperatures dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow was waist-deep in places. Frostbite was epidemic. Men's feet froze in their boots. Weapons jammed from the cold. Foxholes filled with ice water. Medics worked miracles trying to save wounded men in conditions where plasma froze in the bottles and morphine had to be warmed under their arms before it could be injected. Surgeons operated in buildings with no heat, their hands numb, working by lamplight because the power was out. The wounded often had to wait hours or even days for evacuation because the roads were blocked or under fire, and the combat itself was brutal beyond description. This wasn't war at a distance. This was close quarters fighting in forests and villages. Men fought house to house, room to room, sometimes hand to hand. They called in artillery on their own positions when they were being overrun. They fought at night, in blizzards, never sure if the figures moving in the darkness were friends or enemies. The psychological toll was immense. Men who'd survived months or years of combat broke under the strain. Battle fatigue, what we'd now call PTSD, was rampant. Some units had psychiatric casualty rates almost as high as their physical casualty rates. And yet they kept fighting, day after day, because the alternative was letting their buddies down or letting the Germans win. There were individual acts of heroism too numerous to count. Medics who ran through machine gun fire to reach wounded soldiers, tank crews who charged German positions knowing they were outgunned, infantry who held hopeless positions because they'd been ordered to, truck drivers who drove through artillery barrages to deliver ammunition to the front lines. One story that always sticks with me is that of Lieutenant Eric Wood of the 101 Airborne. When his unit was overrun during the initial German attack, Wood refused to surrender. Instead, he took to the forests around the town of Marvy with a small group of soldiers and a sniper rifle. For days, he harassed German positions, sniping at officers, disrupting movements, creating chaos. The Germans put a price on his head. Eventually, he was cornered and killed, but not before he'd tied down German forces that should have been attacking Bastogne. His body wasn't found until January, frozen in the snow, surrounded by dead Germans. Or consider the story of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, one of the few African-American combat units in the European theater. They were attached to various divisions during the battle and fought with distinction, despite facing racism even in the midst of combat. When their positions were overrun, they continued to fire their guns until German tanks were literally on top of them. Many were captured. Some were executed by the Germans, but they never stopped fighting. And then there were the civilians caught in the middle. The people of Belgium and Luxembourg, who'd already endured 4 years of German occupation, suddenly found themselves in a war zone again. Thousands fled their homes in the dead of winter. Others were trapped in the fighting, sheltering in cellars while battles raged overhead. Some villages were completely destroyed. The town of Bastogne itself was heavily damaged by constant artillery bombardment. When it was over, when the guns finally fell silent and the troops moved on, the Ardennes was a wasteland. Burned-out tanks and trucks littered the roadsides. Unexploded shells and mines made the forests deadly. Thousands of bodies still lay frozen in the snow, waiting to be recovered and identified. Many never would be. They'd end up buried as unknowns in military cemeteries. The Battle of the Bulge entered American consciousness in a way few other battles did. It became a symbol of American resilience, of ordinary soldiers accomplishing extraordinary things against overwhelming odds. The defense of Bastogne, in particular, captured the public imagination. McAuliffe's "nuts" response became famous. The 101st Airborne, already legendary from D-Day, became even more so. But the battle also revealed uncomfortable truths. American intelligence had failed to detect the German buildup despite multiple warnings. The initial response was chaotic and disorganized. Many units broke and ran when hit by the German assault. The American Army in 1944 was powerful and well-equipped, but it wasn't invincible, and the Bulge proved it. The Germans, for their part, had shown they could still fight with skill and ferocity even in the war's final months. But they'd also shown the futility of Hitler's strategic vision. The offensive had been doomed from the start, based on assumptions that couldn't possibly be met, that the Allies wouldn't reinforce quickly, that the weather would stay bad indefinitely, that captured fuel dumps would be available, that the Americans would collapse when hit hard enough. Every single assumption proved false. The aftermath of the battle saw recriminations on both sides. German generals who'd opposed the plan blamed Hitler for wasting their last reserves on an impossible objective. Hitler blamed his generals for lacking the will to win. American commanders who'd been caught off guard tried to explain how it had happened. Intelligence officers who'd warned about a possible German offensive, but been ignored, felt vindicated but bitter. And what of Joachim Peiper, the SS officer whose battle group had penetrated furthest and whose men had committed the Malmedy Massacre? He survived the war, was tried for war crimes, and served 11 years in prison. After his release, he lived quietly in France until 1976, when someone discovered who he was. His house was firebombed, and he died in the flames. Some say it was revenge for Malmedy. Others say it was former French resistance fighters settling old scores. Either way, the war caught up with him in the end. The soldiers who fought at the Bulge carried it with them for the rest of their lives. In the years after the war, they formed veteran associations, held reunions, traveled back to the Ardennes to remember and mourn. The people of Belgium never forgot what the Americans had done for them. In Bastogne today, there's a museum dedicated to the battle, and every December 16th, ceremonies are held to commemorate the anniversary. For Americans, the battle became part of the national mythology, the story we tell ourselves about who we are in a crisis. It's been the subject of books, movies, documentaries. It's taught in military academies as an example of both what to do and what not to do. It represents a moment when American soldiers, caught off guard, outgunned, and freezing in the worst winter weather imaginable, refused to give up. But here's what strikes me most about the Battle of the Bulge. It was entirely unnecessary. The war was already won. Germany was already beaten. If Hitler had used those forces defensively, if he'd negotiated while he still had something to bargain with, if he'd accepted reality, the battle never would have happened. More than 170,000 men wouldn't have been killed or wounded. The soldiers at Bastogne could have had a peaceful Christmas. The civilians of the Ardennes wouldn't have had to flee their homes in the middle of winter. But Hitler couldn't accept reality. He'd built his entire identity, his entire regime, on the idea of German strength and inevitable victory. To admit defeat was to admit that everything he'd said for 12 years was a lie. So he gambled, throwing away the lives of his own soldiers and prolonging the agony of his own people, all for a plan that had no real chance of success. And that's perhaps the real lesson of the Battle of the Bulge. It's not just a story about brave soldiers or brilliant tactics or dramatic combat. It's a story about what happens when leaders are so disconnected from reality that they'll sacrifice everything for a fantasy. Hitler believed his own propaganda. He believed that willpower alone could overcome material disadvantage, that one great blow could change everything, that the Allies would collapse if just hit hard enough. He was wrong about all of it. The soldiers on both sides paid the price for his delusion. The American GIs freezing in their foxholes, the German teenagers thrown into battle with minimal training, the civilians caught in the crossfire. None of them had chosen this. They were victims of decisions made by men in warm bunkers far from the fighting, men who were playing games with their lives. When I think about the Battle of the Bulge, I think about those soldiers in Bastogne, surrounded, outnumbered, low on everything except courage. I think about the medics working in the snow to save wounded men. I think about the tank crews buttoning up their hatches and driving into battle knowing they might not come back. I think about the engineers blowing bridges with German tanks a few hundred yards away. I think about all those individual moments of bravery and sacrifice. But I also think about the waste. The waste of lives, the waste of resources, the waste of human potential. Those young men who died in the snow could have gone home, raised families, built careers, lived full lives. Instead, they're buried in military cemeteries or still lying in the Ardennes, never recovered, never identified. And for what? For Hitler's ego? For one last desperate throw of the dice? The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's final gamble, and he lost. But everyone lost. The Germans lost their last reserves and hastened their own defeat. The Americans won, but at a terrible cost, and the people of the Ardennes, who'd already suffered so much, suffered again. In the end, what saved the day wasn't grand strategy or superior equipment or brilliant leadership, though all of those played a role. What saved the day was the courage and resilience of individual soldiers who refused to quit. Guys like the paratroopers at Bastogne, who said nuts to surrender. Guys like the engineers who held St. Vith long after they should have been overrun. Guys like the tank crews who kept fighting even when their ammunition ran low and their tanks were damaged. Guys whose names we'll never know, who did their jobs under impossible conditions because their buddies were depending on them. That's the story of the Battle of the Bulge. Not a story about generals and grand plans, but a story about soldiers in the snow, holding the line, buying time with their blood for reinforcements to arrive and the tide to turn. It's a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when everything was on the line. And it's a reminder, if we needed one, that freedom and democracy aren't free. They're bought and paid for by people willing to stand in the snow, in the worst conditions imaginable, and say, "No, you shall not pass." The soldiers at Bastogne didn't have to be heroes. They could have surrendered, they could have run, but they didn't. They stayed, and they fought, and they won. That's why we remember the Battle of the Bulge 80 years later. Not because it was the biggest battle or the most decisive, but because it represents something fundamental about human courage and resilience. When things look darkest, when the situation seems hopeless, when every rational calculation says to give up, that's when character reveals itself. That's when we learn what people are really made of. The soldiers who fought in the Bulge were made of something special. They deserve to be remembered not just as names on a monument or statistics in a history book, but as real people who faced an impossible situation and somehow came through it. They saved Europe, they saved their buddies, and they showed us all what's possible when ordinary people refuse to accept defeat. Hitler's final gamble failed because he underestimated those ordinary American soldiers. He thought they'd break. He thought they'd run. He thought they'd surrender when faced with overwhelming force. He was wrong, dead wrong, and that miscalculation cost him everything. The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945, but the war ground on for 4 more months. The Allies crossed the Rhine in March, linked up with the Soviets in April, and accepted Germany's surrender in May. Hitler, trapped in his bunker in Berlin, committed suicide rather than face the consequences of his actions. The Thousand-Year Reich lasted 12 years, and it ended in utter ruin. But for the men who fought at the Bulge, the war ended differently. Some didn't make it home. They're still there, in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, eternal sentinels watching over ground they held at such terrible cost. Others came home changed, carrying memories of that frozen hell that would never fully leave them. Yet they also carried something else. Pride. Pride in what they'd accomplished. Pride in their units. Pride in their country. They'd been tested in the crucible of combat and hadn't been found wanting. They'd faced the best Germany had to offer and beaten them. Not because they were supermen, but because they were soldiers who refused to quit. That's the legacy of the Battle of the Bulge. Not Hitler's gamble, which failed. Not the grand strategies, which went awry. But the simple, profound truth that courage matters, that resilience matters, that refusing to give up even when all hope seems lost can change the course of history. The next time you face something that seems impossible, remember Bastogne. Remember those soldiers surrounded in the snow, low on ammunition, outnumbered, freezing, facing impossible odds. And remember what they said when asked to surrender. Nuts. Remember that ordinary people, when pushed to the edge, are capable of extraordinary things. Remember that darkness doesn't last forever, that help is coming, that holding on just a little bit longer can make all the difference. That's the story of the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's final gamble, America's finest hour, and a testament to the courage of soldiers whose names we mostly don't know, but whose sacrifice we should never forget. They fought in the snow and cold of December 1944 so that we could live in freedom. They held the line when the line seemed impossible to hold, and they won. Never forget them. Never forget what they did. Never forget that when everything was on the line, they stood up and said no. The world is better because they did. We are free because they fought. And that's a debt we can never fully repay, but we can honor by remembering their story and telling it to future generations. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble, their finest hour, our lasting legacy. But you know what? I've told you about the big picture, the strategy, the famous moments. Now let me tell you about what it was really like down in those frozen foxholes, because that's where the real story lives. That's where history happened, one soldier at a time, one decision at a time, one frozen finger pulling one trigger. Imagine you're Private John Smith from Ohio. You're 19 years old, and 6 months ago you were working at your dad's hardware store. Now you're crouched in a hole in the ground in Belgium, and it's so cold that your breath freezes in the air before it can dissipate. Your boots are wet because your foxhole keeps filling with icy water that seeps up from the ground. You haven't slept more than an hour at a time in 3 days. You haven't had a hot meal in a week. The K rations you're eating are frozen solid, and you have to thaw them against your body before you can even try to choke them down. Your rifle, that M1 Garand you trained with back at Fort Benning, keeps jamming because the cold makes the oil in the mechanism thick as molasses. You've learned to operate it with minimal lubrication, but that means more jams, more malfunctions, more moments when you pull the trigger and nothing happens. Your hands are so numb you can barely feel the trigger anyway. You took your gloves off to load a fresh clip, and now your fingers are white and waxy, the first stage of frostbite. You should go to the aid station, but the aid station is overflowing with guys who are way worse off than you. And besides, if you leave your position, who's going to watch this sector? That's what it was really like. Not heroic charges and dramatic last stands, though those happened too. Mostly it was cold and miserable and terrifying in a slow, grinding way that wore you down hour by hour. You didn't know if you were going to die from a German bullet, or from the cold, or from exhaustion. After a while, you almost stopped caring. You just wanted it to be over. And the fear. God, the fear. Not the clean, sharp fear of combat, though there was plenty of that. But the deeper fear that came from not knowing what was happening. Were you winning or losing? How many Germans were out there? Where were your own lines? Was help coming, or were you on your own? The officers didn't know. The sergeants didn't know. The radio was dead or crackling with conflicting orders. You were alone in the dark with the sound of German tanks in the distance and no idea if you'd see tomorrow. Let me tell you about a guy named Frank Curry. He was a technical sergeant in the 120th Infantry Regiment, 30 Infantry Division. On December 21st, near the town of Malmedy, his company was pinned down by German fire. They had enemy tanks bearing down on them, machine gun nests covering every avenue of approach, and artillery raining down. It was a killing zone, and they were trapped in it. Curry looked at the situation and made a decision. He grabbed a bazooka and ran straight at the nearest German tank, alone, through machine gun fire. He got close enough to fire, knocked out the tank, then turned to the next one. When he ran out of bazooka rounds, he picked up an automatic rifle from a dead soldier and kept fighting. When that ran out of ammunition, he grabbed a machine gun. He single-handedly held off a German attack for hours, killing or wounding dozens of enemy soldiers, destroying multiple vehicles, buying time for his unit to reorganize and counterattack. He survived the war and was awarded the Medal of Honor. But here's the thing. Curry wasn't some superhuman warrior. He was a mechanic from Michigan. He'd worked in his dad's garage before the war. He didn't do what he did because he was fearless. He did it because his buddies were dying, and somebody had to do something, and he was the somebody. That's heroism. Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. There were thousands of Frank Currys in the Ardennes. Most of them didn't get medals. Most of them didn't even get mentioned in the after-action reports. They just did their jobs, day after day, holding positions that seemed untenable, fighting battles that seemed unwinnable, surviving conditions that seemed unsurvivable, and somehow, collectively, they won. Inside the perimeter at Bastogne, things got progressively worse before they got better. By Christmas Day, the medical supplies were almost gone. Morphine was being rationed. Bandages were being washed and reused. Surgeons were operating on multiple patients simultaneously in a makeshift hospital set up in the barracks. Wounded men were lying on the floor because there weren't enough beds. The stench of gangrene and death filled the air. One surgeon, a Captain Jack Pryor, worked for 72 hours straight, operating on a conveyor belt of shattered bodies. Men with missing limbs, sucking chest wounds, abdominal injuries, head trauma. He operated by lamplight, with limited anesthesia, in a room with no heat. His hands were steady, even though the rest of him was shaking from exhaustion. When someone asked him later how he did it, he said he didn't remember most of it. His mind had shut down everything except the immediate task. Save this man, move to the next one. Save him too, keep going. Don't think, just work. The wounded men themselves showed remarkable courage. They apologized for taking up space. They insisted other, more seriously wounded men be treated first. They bit down on leather straps during surgery to keep from screaming, because they didn't want to demoralize the other wounded. Some of them died silently, not wanting to bother the overworked medics. The only way the staff knew they were gone was when they checked for a pulse during rounds. And outside, in the frozen fields around Bastogne, the fighting continued. German attacks came in waves. Sometimes it was armor, tigers and panthers emerging from the tree line like prehistoric monsters, their guns blasting. Sometimes it was infantry, gray-clad figures moving through the snow, trying to infiltrate the American lines. Sometimes it was both together, combined arms attacks that should have overwhelmed the defenders. But the men of the 101st had something the Germans didn't. They knew they couldn't retreat. There was nowhere to go. It was hold or die. That knowledge, paradoxically, was liberating. No more worrying about orders to withdraw. No more looking over your shoulder for an escape route. You were here, this was your position, and you'd defend it until you couldn't anymore. They developed tactics on the fly. When German tanks approached, small teams would sneak out and plant mines in their path, or hit them with bazookas at close range, aiming for the vulnerable spots. When infantry attacked, the Americans would let them get close, then hit them with everything: rifles, machine guns, grenades, even hand-to-hand combat when it came to that. The 101st's artillery, those few guns that had made it into the perimeter, fired constantly, often at targets so close that the shells screamed just over the heads of American positions. One group of paratroopers occupied a chateau on the edge of town. It was a beautiful old building, or had been before the war. Now it was a fortress, windows sandbagged, walls reinforced, cellars turned into defensive positions. For days, they beat back German attacks, calling in artillery on their own position when enemy troops got into the ground floor. By the time they were finally relieved, the chateau was a ruin, but it was still in American hands. Another group held a wooded area called the Bois Jacques. It wasn't strategic, just a patch of trees northeast of Bastogne, but it overlooked approaches to the town, so it had to be held. The men there dug foxholes in the frozen ground, using picks and axes to break through the earth. They lived in those holes for weeks, never fully dry, never fully warm, constantly under fire. They urinated and defecated in the foxholes because leaving them meant exposing yourself to snipers. They ate, slept, and fought from those holes, sharing them with rats and lice in the ever-present cold. One soldier in the Bois Jacques, a private named Eugene Rowe from Louisiana, was a medic. Over and over he crawled through German fire to reach wounded men. He'd patch them up in the open, bullets kicking up snow around him, then drag them back to cover. He ran out of bandages and used strips torn from his own uniform. He ran out of morphine and could only offer words of comfort to men in agony. He watched friends die because he couldn't save them, then had to push the grief down and move to the next casualty. Rowe survived the battle and the war, but he never talked about it afterward. Medics rarely did. They'd seen too much, done too much, lost too many. The weight of all those deaths, all those men they couldn't save, was a burden they carried silently for the rest of their lives. While Bastogne held out, other battles were raging across the Ardennes. At a place called Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held the northern shoulder of the German advance. This was critical ground. If the Germans broke through here, they'd have a clear run to the Meuse River and beyond, So the Americans held, even though they were outnumbered, even though German artillery pounded their positions day and night, even though the SS Panzer divisions kept attacking with everything they had. The soldiers on Elsenborn Ridge endured some of the heaviest artillery bombardments of the entire war. Shells rained down for hours, turning the snow red with blood, throwing frozen earth and shattered trees into the air. Men went deaf from the concussions. Foxholes collapsed, burying soldiers alive. And when the barrage lifted, here came the tanks and infantry, and the survivors had to climb out of their holes and fight. They held. For days they held. The Germans threw everything at them, but Elsenborn Ridge never fell. It was one of the decisive points of the entire battle, and it was won by cold, exhausted infantrymen who simply refused to break. Further south, at a town called Echternach, a small group of American soldiers held out for days deep behind German lines. They were cut off, surrounded, with no hope of relief or escape. The Germans demanded their surrender. They refused. The Germans attacked. They beat them back. This went on for a week. Finally, when Patton's troops broke through, they found these men still fighting, still holding their positions, having survived on scraps and snowmelt and sheer determination. Stories like this played out across the entire Ardennes front. Small unit actions that individually seem insignificant, but collectively made all the difference. A platoon holding a bridge for an extra hour so that retreating troops could cross. A tank crew knocking out 3 German Tigers before their own tank was destroyed. A forward observer calling in artillery on his own position because Germans had overrun it. These weren't decisions made by generals in warm headquarters. These were split-second choices made by scared, cold, exhausted soldiers who chose to fight rather than quit. And then there were the support troops, the unsung heroes who kept the army functioning. The truck drivers who drove through artillery barrages to bring ammunition to the front lines. The quartermasters who somehow managed to keep supplies flowing even as the front collapsed around them. The signalmen who strung communication wire under fire so that units could stay in contact. The cooks who provided hot meals whenever possible, knowing that a hot cup of coffee could do more for morale than a pep talk from a general. One group of engineers, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, found themselves in the path of Piper's advance. They were supposed to be building bridges and clearing roads, not fighting tanks. But they grabbed whatever weapons they could find and turned themselves into infantry. They blew up bridges in front of advancing German columns. They set up roadblocks and ambushes. They fought delaying actions that bought crucial time for reinforcements to arrive. Many of them died, but they slowed Piper's spearhead at a critical moment. The Air Force played a crucial role once the weather cleared. Fighter bombers, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, roamed the skies over the Ardennes, pouncing on any German vehicle that moved. They destroyed tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, anything that could support the German advance. They flew in terrible weather, taking off from frozen airstrips, navigating by dead reckoning, attacking targets through clouds and snow squalls. The bomber crews flew missions to destroy German supply lines and assembly areas. These were dangerous missions, flying through flak and bad weather to hit targets that were often obscured by clouds. Many planes didn't come back, but the ones that did dropped their bombs with precision, cutting the supply lines that the German offensive depended on. And then there were the transport pilots, the guys who flew the C-47 Dakota cargo planes. When Bastogne was surrounded, these pilots flew supplies in, dropping parachute bundles from altitudes low enough that they could be accurate but high enough to avoid the worst of the German anti-aircraft fire. It was a narrow margin, and it cost lives. Some planes were shot down, but they kept flying, mission after mission, because the men in Bastogne needed those supplies to survive. One pilot, after landing back at base following a supply drop, was asked if he'd been scared. He said no, he'd been too busy to be scared. Then he stepped out of his plane and collapsed. The ground crew caught him and realized he'd been wounded during the flight. A piece of flak had torn through his leg, but he'd stayed at the controls and completed his mission before allowing himself to acknowledge the injury. That was the spirit that won the Battle of the Bulge. Not because Americans were better soldiers than Germans. The Germans fought with skill and courage throughout the battle. Not because American equipment was superior. In many cases, German tanks and weapons were actually better. Americans won because they refused to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed inevitable. Back in Bastogne, when Patton's tanks finally broke through on December 26th, the relief was overwhelming. Men who'd kept their emotions locked down for days suddenly broke down crying. They hugged the tankers, strangers who'd saved their lives. They shared their meager rations, pathetically grateful to have survived. But the celebration was brief because the fighting wasn't over. The Germans continued attacking, trying to cut the corridor that Patton had opened. For days, the battle for Bastogne continued, with attacks and counterattacks, gains and losses measured in hundreds of yards. The 101st, which had held the town against all odds, now had to help expand the perimeter and eliminate the German forces still surrounding them. It took weeks to fully clear the area around Bastogne. Every village, every woods, every hill had to be fought for. The Germans were retreating, but they were fighting every step of the way, making the Americans pay for every mile. The cold continued, the snow continued, the casualties continued. In the northern part of the Bulge, American and British forces launched counterattacks to pinch off the salient. Montgomery, commanding the northern forces, was characteristically cautious, much to the frustration of the Americans who wanted to move faster and trap more Germans. But the operation proceeded, slowly pushing the Germans back, retaking the ground they'd won in the initial assault. By mid-January, the Bulge was flattened. The Americans were back where they'd started, plus or minus a few miles. Looking at a map, it seemed like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Germany had spent its last reserves and gained nothing. The Americans had taken a punch and not only survived, but come back stronger. The psychological impact was enormous. American soldiers who doubted themselves now knew they could beat the best Germany could throw at them. German soldiers who'd believed in final victory now knew it was over. The cleanup after the battle was grim. Thousands of bodies lay frozen in the snow, American and German mixed together in death. Graves registration units worked for months to recover and identify the dead. Many couldn't be identified. Their dog tags were missing, their faces unrecognizable, their bodies too badly damaged. They were buried as unknowns, known only to God. The wounded filled every hospital in the region. Some would recover fully. Others would carry their wounds for life. Missing limbs, blindness, disfigurement, psychological trauma. The hospitals themselves were overwhelmed, operating in damaged buildings with limited supplies, doing the best they could with what they had. And gradually, slowly, the army reorganized and prepared to resume the offensive into Germany. Replacement troops arrived to fill the gaps in units that had been decimated. New equipment replaced what had been lost or destroyed. The massive machine of the American military-industrial complex, which had been producing tanks, planes, trucks, and ammunition in quantities the Germans couldn't match, refilled the depots. For the veterans of the Bulge, there was no rest. Many of them would go on to fight in the final battles of the war, the crossing of the Rhine, the drive into the heart of Germany, the final collapse of the Nazi regime. They'd see concentration camps liberated and German cities reduced to rubble. They'd link up with Soviet forces at the Elbe River and celebrate VE Day in May 1945. But the Bulge stayed with them. It was the worst they'd experienced, the closest they'd come to defeat, the time when everything hung in the balance. Decades later, when they were old men, they'd still remember the cold, still remember the fear, still remember the faces of buddies who didn't make it home. Hitler's final gamble had failed spectacularly. He'd thrown away his last reserves, crippled his remaining armies, and achieved nothing except to delay the inevitable by a few weeks. In his bunker, as the Soviets closed in on Berlin in April 1945, he must have realized that the Ardennes offensive had been the beginning of the end. If he'd kept those forces in reserve, used them to defend Germany itself, the war might have lasted longer. Instead, he'd wasted them in a futile attempt to recreate the glory of 1940. But for the soldiers who fought there, it wasn't about Hitler's strategic miscalculations or grand historical narratives. It was about survival, about doing your job, about not letting down the guy next to you, about holding on just one more hour, getting through one more day, making it to tomorrow. That's the real story of the Battle of the Bulge. Not a story of armies and strategies, but a story of individuals facing impossible circumstances and somehow finding the strength to persevere. It's a story that resonates because we all face our own battles, our own moments when everything seems hopeless and giving up would be so much easier than continuing. The soldiers at Bastogne could have surrendered. Nobody would have blamed them. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, freezing, and running out of supplies. Surrender would have been rational. But they chose to fight. They chose to hold. They chose to believe that help was coming, that their sacrifice mattered, that if they could just hold on a little bit longer, everything would be okay. And they were right. Help came. The siege was lifted. They survived. Not all of them. Too many died in the frozen fields around that small Belgian town. But enough survived to tell the story, to pass it down, to make sure we remember what happened there in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge teaches us that victory isn't inevitable, that freedom has to be defended, that sometimes history turns on the decisions of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Those soldiers in the Ardennes didn't feel like heroes. They felt cold and scared and tired. But they did heroic things anyway, because that's what the moment required. And that's why we still tell this story 80 years later. Because it matters. Because it reminds us what's possible when people refuse to give up. Because it honors the sacrifice of those who fought and died in those frozen forests. Because it's a story not just about war, but about human courage and resilience, and the refusal to accept defeat. Hitler gambled everything on one last throw of the dice, and he lost. But the real winners weren't the generals or the politicians. The real winners were the soldiers who stood in the snow and held the line. They won because they didn't quit. They won because they believed in something bigger than themselves. They won because, when tested, they proved equal to the challenge. That's the legacy of the Battle of the Bulge. That's what we remember. That's what we honor. Not the battle itself, with all its death and destruction, but what it revealed about the human spirit. That even in the darkest hour, even when all seems lost, courage and determination can prevail. That ordinary people, when called upon, can do extraordinary things. That freedom is worth fighting for, even when the cost is high. The soldiers who fought at the Bulge gave us that gift. They paid for it with their blood, their suffering, their lives. The least we can do is remember their story and pass it on to future generations. So they know that freedom isn't free. So they understand that sometimes you have to stand up and fight even when the odds are against you. So they remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble, their finest hour, our lasting legacy. A story of cold and courage, of sacrifice and survival, of ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things. A story that reminds us who we are and what we're capable of when everything is on the line. A story that will echo through the ages as long as people value freedom and honor those who fought to preserve it. Never forget. Never surrender. Never stop telling the story of what happened in the Ardennes in the winter of 1944, when American soldiers said no to tyranny and yes to freedom, and changed the world.